Hello everyone, this is Ola. In this video, I'll discuss the brain anatomy briefly. So there are three important divisions of our brain. The cerebrum, which is the largest division. The cerebellum, it means a small cerebrum. And the brain stem. The brain stem continues down to change its name into the spinal cord as it exits through foramen magnum of the skull. The surface of the cerebrum has elevations and depressions. The elevation is called a gyrus. So remember that a gyrus grows up and the depression is a sulcus. So remember that a sulcus sinks down. It's a kind of a groove. There are two cerebral hemispheres, right and left, and the longitudinal fissure is in between. The two cerebral hemispheres communicate informations back and forth through the corpus callosum. So this here in yellow is a commissural tract that communicates information between the right and left cerebral hemispheres. What is a tract to begin with? A tract is a group of myelinated axons. That's why it's white colored. So this is a white matter because the myelin sheath is white colored. And the tract communicate information within the central nervous system from one area to another. If the tract communicate information between the two cerebral hemispheres, we call that a commissural tract. If it communicates information within the same cerebral hemisphere, it is an association tract. And if it communicates information between the brain and the spinal cord, we call that a projection tract. The cerebrum has important four lobes. The front one is the frontal lobe, and this is the one that is responsible for decision making, thinking, cognitive function, memory, and also it has the primary motor cortex, meaning that our skeletal muscle movements begin from the frontal lobe. Then this one is the parietal lobe, and our body sensations are represented here. So it is the sensory cortex. Here, closer to the ear, is the temporal lobe, and this has the hearing or auditory cortex. And posteriorly, this is the occipital lobe, and here our vision is processed. So it has the vision center. Let's focus on some important sulci and gyri. So this is the central sulcus, and it is in between the frontal lobe and parietal lobe. So anything anterior to that central sulcus belongs to the frontal lobe. Anything posterior to belongs to the parietal lobe. In front of the central sulcus, we have the precentral gyrus. Of course, this belongs to the frontal lobe, and this is responsible for our skeletal muscle movement. So it is a motor center. This is a primary motor center. And then behind the central sulcus, we have the post-central gyrus, and this is belonging to the parietal lobe, and this has the sensory cortex. This sulcus here between the temporal lobe, frontal and parietal lobe on the other side is the lateral sulcus. Here in the temporal lobe, we have the superior temporal gyrus, and this is the hearing center. So here are the two cerebral hemispheres, and here is the central sulcus, and anterior to the central sulcus, we have the precentral gyrus. So this is belonging to one hemisphere, and this is to the other hemisphere. And then posterior posterior to the central sulcus, we have the post-central gyrus. Okay, so the precentral gyrus has our motor cortex, and actually our skeletal muscles are represented in the precentral gyrus. The body muscles are represented upside down. So up here we have the foot, the genitals are very close to the foot, then here's the knee, and then the trunk, upper limb, and then as you can see, the face is down. So the motor representation of the body is kind of upside down. And the motor representation is not proportional to the size of the organ. So if you look at the fingers, they have the same area like your trunk. Why? Because we move our fingers more. There are the skill movement, the fine movements are performed by the fingers. So they really need a wide representation on the cortex. The face has a large area because of the facial expression muscles that we use all the time. If you look at the sensory representation on the post-central gyrus, also the body is represented upside down here in the post-central gyrus, and the representation is larger for the lips, for the fingers, and for the genitals. So they have more representation on the cortex. So of course, the fingers like feel anything the most. So if you are touching something with your forehead in comparison to fingers, the fine sensation, the detailed sensation comes from our fingers. That's why they have a larger representation on the post-central gyrus. Okay, now let's look at this sagittal view of the brain. So now we are looking at one hemisphere, and this is the medial side of that hemisphere. So down here is the cerebellum, and this is actually to maintain our balance and coordinate movement. So this is the corpus callosum, and this is the commissural tract that communicates the right and left cerebral hemispheres. This area here is the thalamus. The thalamus relays information between the cortex and the brainstem. So information has to go through the thalamus so that it reaches its area on the cerebral cortex, and the ones coming from the cortex also has to leave through the thalamus. So the thalamus is actually the primary gate for every sensation, except one, which is the smell, olfaction. For example, the vision has to go through the thalamus, takes permission, and then goes to the occipital lobe, which is the primary vision center. The hearing has to go through this gate, takes permission, and then goes to the temporal lobe that has a primary hearing center. Touch, for example, has to enter through the thalamus and then go to the post-central gyrus that has the primary sensory cortex. So the thalamus arranges what goes first, what goes second. It's like a guard standing at a gate, and then arranges what enters first, what leaves first, what enters second, and so on. So this is the thalamus. Down to the thalamus, we have the hypothalamus. It looks like the letter W. The hypothalamus is the command for the endocrine system. So you can consider the hypothalamus to be the president for the endocrine system. This hypothalamus controls this gland, which is the pituitary gland, and then the pituitary gland controls other endocrine glands. So you may consider the hypothalamus to be the president, and then the pituitary gland here to be the vice president that controls the population, the other endocrine glands. This here, which is behind the thalamus, I consider this to be the ponytail for the thalamus, is the pineal gland, and this produces the melatonin hormone that helps to sleep. This is a pituitary gland. Again, this is controlled by the hypothalamus. And then here is the upper part of the brain stem, which is the midbrain. So the midbrain has this anterior area, and then it has this posterior area, and there is a canal in between that we call cerebral aqueduct. And the midbrain is the part of the brain stem that relays visual and motor and hearing information. Then this is the pons, and the pons has this kind of little tummy, and this regulates the respiratory rhythm. So you may remember that the midbrain has a butt, and the pons has a tummy. And then down here we have the medulla, and this controls our autonomic functions, like it has the cardiovascular center, digestive center, respiratory center, and so on. Now let's do a coronal section or a frontal section, like cutting our brain into front and back. Then here at the base of the brain, you will find those nuclei. And a nucleus means collection of cell bodies inside the central nervous system. Those nuclei are called basal nuclei. They are important to plan movement. During rest, they prevent unnecessary movements. That's why in case they are damaged, the Parkinsonism disease happen. So because the basal nuclei are not functioning well anymore, so unnecessary movements are not prevented. That's why resting tremors happens as the patient is not moving. So resting tremors is belonging to the Parkinsonism, and it happens when the basal nuclei are damaged. Let's look at the inferior view of the brain. So here is the frontal lobe, and at the base of the frontal lobe, we have the olfactory bulbs. So here, the olfactory nerves end, and this carries olfaction, means smell. Then this is an optic nerve. This is the other optic nerve. When they cross over, we call this area the optic chiasma. And here is the pituitary gland, which is very close to the optic chiasma. That's why in case there is a tumor affecting the pituitary gland, it pressures the optic chiasma, leading to vision problems. Here is the brain stem, and the upper part is the midbrain, then pons, and then the medulla. What lobes can you see from the inferior side? You can see the frontal and temporal. The parietal cannot be seen from the inferior side, or the occipital.